I woke up choking, flames licking through my bedroom door. The sound, like a freight train roaring, drowned out my wife's screams in the next room. Our two kids never made a sound. Nothing could have prepared me for the panic and the searing heat that ate my world alive that night. People say you never forget your darkest moment. I pray they're wrong. Hit like, subscribe for more betrayal stories, and comment your city or country. The smell of burned plastic and nightmares still follows me everywhere I go. I remember the paramedics lifting me out of the ashes, their faces a blur, talking about how lucky I was to survive. Luck wasn't it. Maybe fate, one that felt more like punishment. My wife, Brooke, and my kids, Fiona and Grant, died in that fire. The house was gone. The police called it an accident, box checked, case closed. Just another tragedy no one wants to read about. But I couldn't move on. Not when something felt twisted in the pit of my stomach, a whisper telling me it wasn't just fate or bad wiring. I sat across from the lead detective, Blake Carson, a cop whose handshake felt like limp celery. No warmth, no humanity. His eyes never met mine. He asked questions like he was reading from a script. Did you leave candles burning? Any electrical problems in the house? No enemies, right? But our insurance had just been renewed, and barely a week before, Carson had argued with my wife on our street over, of all things, a parking ticket. She told me he scared her, said he threatened to make trouble if we didn't drop the complaint we'd filed against another officer. It kept haunting me. Every small detail, every look Carson shot at me as if he wanted me gone and silent. But the hardest part was my own family turning away, tired of my obsession. My brother Mason told me, "You gotta accept what happened, Colin. You're driving yourself crazy." I wanted to believe him. God, I did. But I kept pushing. Nights got longer, sleep impossible. I drive by the burned remains of my home just to feel something again, anything but the numb ache. Once, I caught Carson parked along my old street, eyes on my mailbox. He sped off before I could confront him. What was he looking for? I started keeping a notebook, mapping out every tiny piece. Insurance files, police reports, neighbor statements. The stories didn't add up. The fire started in the garage, but the garage door was locked. That made no sense. Brooke always parked outside after Carson's threat. The world, once so ordinary, was now all questions. Why had no one seen anything? Was someone paid off? Then, a neighbor, elderly Mrs. Harper, confided in me. I saw a man that night. Late, maybe midnight. He had a police jacket, and I swear it was the same one who drove off in a gray Chevy. Her voice trembled. He's been back since. Watching you. For the first time, anger broke through my grief. I buried my family, but I couldn't bury this. Carson might have set that fire. He may have thought a parking ticket was worth ruining 3 lives. But I served 23 years as a Green Beret. The worst mistake any man can make is thinking I'm finished. I remembered the quiet lessons learned in places no one brags about. Sometimes, justice isn't loud. It's relentless, persistent, waiting for the moment when the truth fights its way out. At night, I sat in my new apartment, photos of Brooke, the kids, and old deployment medals on my dresser. I promised them I would not forget, no matter how hard they tried to bury my pain in paperwork. For now, the cop who burned my world thinks he's untouchable, but he doesn't know who I am yet. Carson showed up at the memorial service uninvited. He stood at the back, hands folded, face blank as stone. When people gave their condolences, he nodded like he was doing them a favor by being there. My stomach twisted every time I caught his reflection in the church windows. After the service, he walked up to me. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. "I'm real sorry for your loss, Colin. If there's anything I can do, anything at all, you just let me know." I stared at him, studying the fake concern painted across his face. There was no warmth, just cold calculation. "Thanks," I muttered, throat dry. He patted my shoulder. Too hard, too long, then walked away. That night, I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, pretending. My brother Mason called, trying to check in, but I brushed him off. I didn't need more people telling me to let it go. Days turned into weeks. The insurance company dragged their feet, asking for more documents, more proof. Every request felt like a stall tactic. I started wondering if Carson had connections there too. Small-town cops know everyone: judges, lawyers, insurance adjusters. One phone call, and suddenly your claim gets complicated. I kept digging. Late nights at the public library, scrolling through old newspaper archives. Carson's name popped up more than once, always in the background of cases that got dismissed or buried, complaints that vanished, witnesses who suddenly stopped talking. Then I found something, a lawsuit filed against him 3 years ago by a man named Dominic Wells. Harassment, threats, property damage. The case was dropped after Wells moved out of state. I tracked down his number through an old address listing. When I called, his voice was cautious. "Who's this?" "My name's Colin. I'm trying to find out more about Blake Carson." Silence. Then a bitter laugh. "You got trouble with him too?" "You could say that." He sighed. "Look, I can't help you. That guy's connected. When I tried to fight back, my car got torched. My lawyer quit. Even my landlord suddenly wanted me gone. I left because I had no choice." "What did you do to make him angry?" "Nothing. I caught him taking money from a drug dealer outside a bar. Told the wrong person I saw it. Next thing I know, my life's falling apart." My chest tightened. This was bigger than a parking ticket. "Thanks for telling me." "Be careful," Dominic said before hanging up. "He doesn't stop until you're gone." I sat in my car outside the library, hands shaking. Carson wasn't just corrupt, he was dangerous. And he'd already proven how far he'd go. My friend Tristan, an old army buddy, invited me over for beers. I needed someone who understood, someone who wouldn't try to talk me out of what I was feeling. "You look like hell," he said, handing me a bottle. "Feel worse." We sat on his porch, the night air cool and quiet. "You still thinking that cop had something to do with it?" I nodded. "I know he did." Tristan leaned back. "You gonna go after him?" "I'm gonna find proof first. Then let the system handle it." He looked at me like I was naive. "The system? Man, you know better than that." He was right. I did know better. But I wasn't ready to throw away everything I stood for. Not yet. That weekend, I drove past Carson's house. Nice place. Too nice for a cop's salary. Brand new truck in the driveway. Boat parked on the side. Where was all that money coming from? I took photos, noted the times he came and went. He had visitors, men in expensive suits, cars with tinted windows. None of it felt legitimate. Then one night, I saw him loading boxes into his truck. Heavy boxes, moving fast like he was in a hurry. He looked over his shoulder more than once, paranoid. I followed him at a distance. He drove out to a storage unit on the edge of town, unloaded everything, locked it up, and left. I waited until he was gone, then walked around the facility. Unit 47. No windows, heavy padlock. Whatever he was hiding, it was in there. My phone buzzed. A text from Mason. "Stop this. You're scaring everyone." I didn't reply. My family wanted me to move on, but they didn't understand. Brooke and the kids deserved more than a closed case and fake sympathy. They deserved the truth. Carson thought he'd covered his tracks. He thought I was just another grieving husband too broken to fight back. But I'd spent 2 decades tracking enemies in places where mistakes meant death. He had no idea what was coming. The insurance money barely covered a fraction of what I lost, but I took it anyway. Starting over in someone else's borrowed clothes felt like slipping into someone else's skin. New walls, fresh paint, but the burnt smell lingered inside me. Every moment felt temporary, every word from my family forced. The town moved on, but I was left rebuilding a life that never truly felt like mine. I used what little I had to rent a small place on the outskirts, far from the memories and burned-out shell of my old home. The landlord, Preston, seemed nice enough. He asked no questions, just handed me the keys and said, "If you need to talk, I'm around." His kindness felt alien after weeks of cold bureaucracy. The first night in that apartment was silent except for the ceaseless hum of thoughts whirling in my head. The only light was from a street lamp outside, filtering dusty beams across the walls. I set down a photo of Brooke and the kids on a makeshift shelf and promised myself it would one day rest in a real home. Work was harder than ever. I returned to the construction company where I'd spent years before the army, but everything felt different. The crew tiptoed around me, voices dropping anytime I walked into the break room. My supervisor, Quentin, tried his best to offer sympathy, but there was a limit to how much lost people could stand before they started treating you like a ghost. One evening, Preston stopped by the apartment with a box of groceries. "I figured you could use these," he said, pushing the box over. I nodded, mumbling thanks. He looked around, noticing the bare shelves and unpacked boxes. "Things get better," he said, "but you gotta give it time." Time. That word stung. Time wasn't healing anything. It was stretching the distance between my old life and the faded copy I lived now. I buried myself in habits, fixing small things around the apartment, scrubbing flour from the sink, even though nobody baked there before me. Sometimes, late at night, I drove past my old neighborhood. The burned house stood out like a scar. Neighbors had set up a makeshift memorial, a few plastic flowers, pictures, candles. Watching from the shadows, I saw Carson patrol the block twice that week, his cruiser crawling past, as if marking territory. Every time, he slowed at the mailbox, then sped off. My head swam with questions. Was he starting to worry that I'd found something? Or was he checking to make sure his story stayed buried? I started to rethink everything about how the fire started and why the official report felt so hurried. Determined to find something, I asked Preston about the security cameras lining our street. He surprised me. "They're old, but some still work." "What?" I hesitated, then said, "Just want to feel safer." He shrugged. "Let me know if you want to check footage." "Happy to help." That week, I spent hours watching grainy footage, looking for patterns. 12 days after moving in, Carson's cruiser passed my apartment at 2:05 a.m. He didn't stop, but the sight of him circling unsettled me. At work, Quentin noticed I was distracted. He pulled me aside. "Take a few days off, Colin. You've been running on fumes." "I just need to keep busy," I said, forcing a smile. Then, one morning, I found a note slipped under my door. "I know what happened. Be careful who you trust." No signature, no hints, just the chilling message and the sense that every step I took was watched. Worse, rumors started swirling about why my family died. Some said it was bad luck, others whispered about enemies I'd made in the army. I kept quiet, focusing on what mattered, piecing together the truth without losing myself in grief or paranoia. Tristan dropped by on a Sunday, bringing coffee and his usual blunt honesty. "You have anyone helping you?" I shook my head. "You're gonna need backup. Someone in town wants you gone." "You think it's Carson?" He leaned in, voice low. "I know it is, but you gotta be smart." As weeks went by, my notebook filled with more clues, license plates, times, names. Bit by bit, the web Carson spun started unraveling. Small slip-ups, little errors that he never thought anyone would notice because he assumed I was broken beyond repair. Each day I rebuilt, not just my new home, but my determination to fight for the truth. Tristan's warning echoed in my mind as I sat by the window each night, jotting down the comings and goings on my block. The notebook was filling up with patterns, Carson's patrols, the times he lingered near my mailbox, the strange cars that drove by at odd hours. I started noticing one dark sedan that always seemed parked farther down the street, engine running, headlights off. It never stayed long, but every time it appeared, I felt eyes on me. Determined to understand Carson's real motives, I began digging deeper into his history. Small-town secrets are rarely buried deep, and with my years of Green Beret instincts, I knew how to sift through rumor and fact. Local court records revealed Carson's involvement in 2 cases swept quietly under the rug years ago, a drug bust gone wrong, and an assault charge no one ever spoke about, but the name showed up in paperwork. I reached out to the only person left in town who talked openly about Carson, Mrs. Harper, my elderly neighbor who'd seen him lurking the night of the fire. She invited me in, set out tea, and spoke in a shaky voice. I never trusted that man, she whispered, hands trembling. Used to see him slip out late, meet up with rough-looking men near the old mill. Some folks say he's been covering up crimes for years, just to keep his own record clean. For the first time, I realized my story wasn't just about revenge. It was about unraveling a web that touched more people than just my family. Carson had enemies in places I never expected, and alliances with local big shots who kept him safe. One afternoon at the courthouse, I ran into Judge Victor, a man known for his fairness but also his caution. He looked at me, sympathy flickering behind tired eyes. "I heard you're asking questions, Colin," he said quietly. "Be careful. You're not the first to get burned trying to take down Carson." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "I just want justice," I replied, voice low. He nodded. "Sometimes that's the hardest thing to come by around here." Back at home, I found more clues sewn into public files. Carson owned property across town, a rundown warehouse registered under a relative's name. He wasn't just a cop. He was running something behind the scenes, far bigger than anyone admitted. That evening, I checked my notebook's map, marking every location that tied Carson to secret meetings or hidden income. Each spot grew into a bigger picture, a network of corruption, threats, payoffs that made my family an acceptable casualty in his eyes. The realization left me colder than I'd felt since the night of the fire. Preston, my landlord, dropped by again, this time with news from a retired officer he once knew. "Carson's always been slippery, Colin. Just a heads up, he's asking about you at the precinct. You might want to keep your head down until you figure out your next move." I thanked him and dug deeper. It was time to bring in outside help, someone with enough legal weight to make Carson nervous. Through Tristan, I made contact with Daphne, a sharp, relentless lawyer who had a reputation for exposing dirty deals. She listened patiently as I laid out the timeline, the evidence, the haunting memory of my family's tragedy. "I'll need proof, hard proof," she said, "and you'll need to watch your back. No one takes on a cop like Carson alone and walks away clean." Days blurred into nights as we gathered documentation, surveillance footage, phone logs. Daphne guided me with quiet resolve, pressing for the smallest detail that could tip the balance against Carson. Every step brought risk, strange cars trailing me, unmarked envelopes arriving in my mailbox, threatening silence on the other end of late-night calls. I kept focused. Quiet revenge isn't rushed. It's built on dignity, legacy, and evidence that force people to confront evil, even if they'd rather ignore it. As the investigation widened, my grief found a new purpose. The secrets I uncovered made my family's death part of a story bigger than I'd ever imagined. A story with the power to drag a corrupt cop out of the shadows, no matter how deeply he tried to hide. The deeper I probed into Carson's trail, the more I realized how alone I truly was. Trust became currency, rare, impossible to spend twice. With each new piece of evidence, I wondered who in my shrinking circle was hiding secrets, and who might be helping the man who destroyed my world. Late one evening, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then answered. "It's Tristan." His voice sounded strained. "You need to come here now." I drove to Tristan's place, a rundown cottage by the lake, headlights stabbing through the darkness. Tristan greeted me on the porch, eyes red and jaw tight. "There's something you should know," he said quietly, refusing to meet my gaze. Inside, the air felt heavier than usual. Tristan shut the blinds before speaking. "I got a call last night," he started, "from someone offering money to keep quiet. About Carson. About you." He slid an envelope across the table, bills stuffed inside, far more than what anyone should pay for silence. "I wanted to tell you right away," Tristan said. "You're my friend. But I almost took it. Things have been tight. I felt the ground slip beneath me, not anger, but a hollow ache. It's okay, I managed. Just means we can't trust anyone. Tristan nodded, his shame obvious. The betrayal stung, but it confirmed what I feared. Carson's reach extended into the cracks of my own life. Days passed, and the tension in town grew thicker. Mason grew distant, almost refusing my calls. When I caught up with him at the hardware store, he glanced around and lowered his voice. "Colin, people are talking. They say you're stirring up trouble. Maybe let it go, man." His words sounded rehearsed, like he'd been coached. "I won't stop until I know the truth," I said, firm. He sighed deeply. "Just be careful. Some folks aren't who they seem." After leaving, I spotted a familiar face, Judge Victor standing outside, talking to Carson. Their exchange was brief, faces tight with worry. I noted it in my journal. Patterns were forming, allies and adversaries, lines blurring in the sweat and fear. I took Daphne's advice seriously, turning my questions away from the obvious and seeking out quieter voices. That led me to Eliza, Brooke's longtime friend, who worked at the county clerk's office. She invited me for coffee, glancing nervously at the registers. "There are records you haven't seen," she whispered. "Files Carson buried. I can get you copies, but you didn't hear that from me." Eliza passed me documents at a park later that week. Records of internal complaints, financial irregularities, text messages erased from official logs. "I can't do more without risking my job," she admitted, fear flashing in her eyes. I thanked her, knowing each clue brought Carson closer to exposure. The strain of the search wore me down. My sleep grew restless, haunted not just by the fire, but by the quiet betrayals piling up. Friends avoided me in public, neighbors crossed the street. Preston dropped by with groceries, concern clouding his usual good cheer. "People say you're making trouble for yourself," he cautioned. "But I believe you." I clung to his support, aware that trust had become both weapon and shield. Returning home one afternoon, I found my apartment door ajar, papers shuffled, items misplaced. Someone had been inside. My notebook, with months of surveillance and notes, was gone. Panic surged. I scoured the apartment, but it was clear someone wanted to destroy my progress. Retracing my steps, I realized only 3 people besides me had keys: Preston, the landlord, Quentin from work, and Mason, my brother. Doubt gnawed at me. By sundown, Tristan had arrived, bringing a replacement notebook and a quiet apology. "Whatever Carson's paying, it doesn't buy loyalty from everyone." We patched together what we could remember, certain now that betrayal was not just a wound, but a weapon used by people desperate to hide the truth. With Eliza's new files and Tristan's renewed support, my investigation pressed forward. Where trust fell apart, resolve grew stronger. Carson's secrets were catching up, and I was finished letting betrayal rule my life. Daphne worked late behind her desk, poring over the documents Eliza delivered. Every file, every email, linked Carson to trouble, but none were enough on their own. I watched as she stitched together a narrative that painted the picture I'd suspected for months. Carson was deep in schemes most good cops would turn away from. We needed just one more strand, something that would force the town to look up and listen. I drifted between meetings with Daphne and quiet hours in my apartment, sense of isolation growing. Preston stopped by again, dropping off a hot meal and news about the latest police shakeup. Another officer, Harper, had resigned suddenly. Preston shrugged. "Nobody says why, but rumor is Carson's involvement." The list of allies and enemies kept shifting. Tristan soldiered on at my side, always ready to scan surveillance footage or provide backup at tense moments. But trust was fragile. Every errand, every phone call, felt like a gamble. Who else was listening? That weekend, Daphne arranged a meeting with Judge Victor, hoping his respected voice could open doors. We sat in his dimly lit office, evidence spread on the table. Victor leaned over the files, quiet but concerned. "You're playing a dangerous game, Colin," he warned. "Carson's protected. But this," He tapped the paperwork. If it gets out, half the precinct will go down with him. I nodded. I don't care about the rest. I need the truth. For Brooke. For my kids. Victor agreed to discreetly review the case and, if possible, discreetly leak details to a state investigator. It felt like the first real progress. When I left his office, dusk fell heavy over the courthouse. I couldn't help but imagine Carson behind blinds somewhere, watching, ready to retaliate. Days blurred into tense silence. Daphne's phone rang off the hook, calls with warnings, threats, half-hearted apologies from people who had once promised justice. One morning, she received a plain brown envelope. Inside, records of payments from Carson to Harper, coded as consulting fees. It was the missing link. A dishonest cop bought silence with stolen cash. We compiled the information and planned our next move. I spent restless nights reviewing our story, tightening the timeline, pinning crucial evidence below grainy photos and receipts. Tristan kept pace, investigating phone logs, surveillance, diving into reports that threatened to uncover more secrets. But helping hands grew scarce. Quentin at work became distant, no longer greeting me in the mornings. Even Preston's visits grew shorter, his usual kindness shaded by cautious glances. You're close, Colin, he warned. But when justice shakes loose, nobody in town will feel safe. Around midnight, I answered an unlisted number. A trembling voice, Harper. I'm sorry for what happened to you, Colin. Carson forced my hand. If you get him, I'll testify. I just want out. I promised safety as best I could, grateful for the final piece we needed. With Daphne at my side and Victor's subtle push, we filed the allegations. Pre-trial hearings were set quickly. News buzzed through the small town. Carson tried intimidation, sending threats to Daphne and staking out our homes. I stood at the window, watching cop cars circle, certain I'd made the right enemies. Allies had never felt so precious, and adversaries so relentless. But every person who stood by my family proved what mattered most. The resolve to fight for dignity, truth, and justice when betrayal was a cold fire in your heart. The town buzzed with rumors the moment word spread about the allegations. Carson's name appeared in headlines. Whispers grew louder in grocery stores and diners. But instead of backing down, he doubled his efforts to silence me. I knew the stakes had risen when I noticed the surveillance intensify, unmarked cars parked outside my apartment, strange faces appearing at coffee shops I frequented. Then came the moment everything shifted. I was leaving the courthouse after meeting with Daphne when Carson stepped out from behind a parked truck. His face was pale, jaw clenched tight. For the first time since this began, I saw something new in his eyes, fear. You don't know what you're doing, he said, voice shaking slightly. I stopped, held his gaze. I know exactly what I'm doing. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think you're some hero? You're just a guy who lost his family. Walk away while you still can. I could feel the tension crackling between us. Then, almost as if he couldn't help himself, he added, I did my homework on you, Colin. Green Beret, 23 years. Afghanistan, Iraq, places most people don't come back from the same. My blood ran cold. He knew. Carson had finally figured out who I really was. His confidence wavered as he continued. You think I'm scared of you? I've dealt with worse. But his trembling hands told a different story. He was terrified, not of the law, but of me. I leaned in, kept my voice steady. Then you should know what happens when people like me decide something needs to be done. He stepped back, eyes darting left and right, paranoia seeping through his composure. Stay away from me, he muttered, then walked quickly to his cruiser and drove off. That night, everything changed. Carson's fear became his weakness. He started making mistakes, sloppy, desperate moves that exposed him further. Tristan called me the next morning, excitement cutting through his usual calm. Carson pulled all his money out of 3 accounts yesterday. He's running scared. Daphne confirmed it. He contacted his lawyer twice in one day. That's panic, Colin. We've got him rattled. But rattled men are dangerous. 2 days later, my apartment was vandalized, windows smashed, furniture overturned. The message was clear: back off or face worse. Instead of fear, I felt resolve harden like steel. Carson had burned my family alive. A few broken windows meant nothing. I moved my evidence to a secure location and stayed with Tristan temporarily. We strategized late into the night, anticipating Carson's next move. The man was cornered, and cornered animals strike without thinking. Judge Victor reached out through Daphne, warning that Carson had tried reaching other officials, attempting to discredit me as unstable, obsessed, dangerous. But Victor stood firm, promising the case would proceed fairly. Then came the breakthrough. Harper, the former cop who'd agreed to testify, delivered recordings. Conversations between Carson and his associates discussing payoffs, threats, and chillingly, the fire at my house. We had to shut him up. Carson's voice crackled through the audio. Family was collateral. Hearing those words felt like a fist crushing my chest. My family wasn't even human to him, just obstacles in his corrupt path. Daphne moved fast, submitting the recordings as evidence. Within hours, Carson was placed under investigation by state authorities. His carefully built empire began crumbling. Officers distanced themselves. Witnesses came forward. People who'd been silent for years suddenly found courage. But Carson wasn't finished. He made one final, desperate play. He tried to frame me. Anonymous tips flooded the police about threats I supposedly made, fabricated evidence designed to paint me as the real danger. For a moment, the town hesitated, unsure who to believe. That's when my military record became the shield I needed. Daphne presented testimonials from former commanders, proof of my character, my service, my integrity. The contrast between Carson's corruption and my decades of honorable service was undeniable. Carson's fear turned to panic. He stopped appearing in public, holed up in his home with lawyers scrambling to save him. But the recordings, the documents, the testimonies, it was too much. The man who thought he was untouchable finally realized he'd targeted the wrong person. A Green Beret doesn't quit. We're trained to survive, adapt, and complete the mission no matter the cost. Carson's hidden fear had become his undoing. And justice, slow and relentless, was closing in. The courtroom felt colder than I expected. Rows of wooden benches filled with townspeople, reporters scribbling notes, lawyers shuffling papers. I sat behind Daphne, hands folded, heart pounding against my ribs. Across the aisle, Carson sat stiff in his chair, flanked by two attorneys who looked expensive and worried. This was it. Months of grief, investigation, sleepless nights, all leading to this moment. Judge Victor presided, his face stern and unreadable. He glanced at me briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement, then called the court to order. The room fell silent. Daphne stood, calm and composed. She began laying out the evidence. Financial records showing Carson's illegal income, witness testimonies from Harper and Dominic Wells, surveillance footage of Carson near my home the night of the fire. Each piece built the case, layer by layer, until the picture was undeniable. Then came the recordings. The courtroom speakers crackled to life. Carson's voice filled the room, cold and calculated. We had to shut him up. Family was collateral. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe. Hearing those words again felt like reliving the fire, the screams, the heat, the helplessness. When I opened my eyes, Carson's face had gone pale. His lawyers whispered frantically, but there was no escaping what everyone had just heard. Daphne called Harper to the stand. The former cop looked broken, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast. He admitted everything, taking bribes, covering up Carson's crimes, staying silent when he should have spoken. I knew what he did, Harper said quietly. I knew about the fire, but I was too scared to say anything. The prosecution pressed him. Did Carson admit to setting the fire? Harper nodded. He said it was necessary. That Colin and his family were becoming a problem. The courtroom erupted. Judge Victor slammed his gavel, calling for order. I sat frozen, grief and rage battling inside me. My family died because we complained about a parking ticket, because we dared to challenge a corrupt cop. Daphne rested her case, the evidence overwhelming. Carson's defense tried to argue lack of direct proof, claiming the recordings were out of context, that Harper was unreliable. But the jury's faces told the story. They'd already made up their minds. Then it was my turn to speak. Judge Victor allowed me a victim impact statement. I stood slowly, legs shaking, and walked to the front of the courtroom. Every eye was on me. I looked at Carson, his arrogance finally stripped away, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who knew he'd lost. I spoke, voice steady despite the storm inside. My wife, Brooke, was kind. She loved gardening, baking cookies for neighbors, volunteering at the school. My daughter, Fiona, wanted to be a teacher. My son, Grant, dreamed of playing baseball. I paused, swallowing hard. They weren't collateral. They were everything. And you took them from me because you thought you were above the law. Carson looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I served this country for 23 years, I continued. I fought for people like you to have the freedom to live without fear. And you repaid that by burning my family alive. The room was silent, tension thick enough to cut. I didn't come here for revenge. I came for justice. So my wife and kids aren't forgotten. So their deaths mean something. I sat down, exhausted but relieved. Daphne squeezed my shoulder gently. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted again, some cheering, others crying. I felt nothing at first, just numb. Then, slowly, relief washed over me. It was done. Carson was sentenced to life without parole. Additional charges were filed against his associates, and the entire corruption network began to unravel. Officers resigned, officials stepped down, the town forced to confront the rot that had festered for years. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, asking how I felt. I kept it simple. Justice doesn't bring my family back, but it honors their memory. Daphne walked with me to my car, exhaustion written across her face. You did it, Colin. You got him. I nodded. We did it. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the photo of Brooke and the kids. For the first time since the fire, I felt something close to peace. The fight was over. Carson would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and my family's story wouldn't be buried in lies. Emotional justice isn't loud or flashy. It's quiet, dignified, relentless. It's standing up when everything tells you to give up. It's honoring the people you lost by refusing to let their deaths be meaningless. I'd done what I set out to do. Now, it was time to start healing. 3 weeks after the verdict, I received a letter. Prison stationery, no return address needed. I knew who it was from before I opened it. Carson's handwriting was shaky, nothing like the arrogant cop who once thought himself untouchable. I need to speak with you. One conversation. That's all I'm asking. I stared at those words, anger rising in my chest. Part of me wanted to burn the letter and forget he existed. But another part, the part that needed closure, knew I had to go. Daphne advised against it. You don't owe him anything, Colin. He's trying to manipulate you. Maybe, I said. But I need to hear what he has to say. Face to face. The prison was 2 hours away, gray concrete walls rising against a cloudy sky. I checked in at the front desk, passed through metal detectors, and was led down sterile hallways that smelled of bleach and despair. Carson sat in the visitation room, hands cuffed, orange jumpsuit hanging loose on his frame. He'd lost weight, aged years in just weeks. When he saw me, something flickered in his eyes, regret, fear, maybe both. I sat down across from him, separated by scratched plexiglass. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Thank you for coming, he finally said, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond, just waited. He swallowed hard. I know nothing I say will make a difference, but I needed to tell you. I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, hollow and insufficient. Sorry, I repeated, voice cold. You burned my family alive. You took everything from me. And you think sorry means something? Carson looked down at his cuffed hands. No, I know it doesn't. But I need you to understand, I never meant for it to go that far. Then what did you mean? I leaned forward, anger barely contained. What was the plan, Carson? Scare us? Threaten us into silence? He nodded slowly. It was supposed to be a warning. Just damage the garage, make you back off from the complaint. But the accelerant spread faster than I expected. By the time you realized my wife and kids were already dead, I finished, voice shaking. Carson's face crumpled. For the first time, I saw genuine remorse. Or maybe just the reality of what he'd done finally crashing down on him. I panicked, he admitted. I covered it up, threatened witnesses, tried to bury it. I thought if I could just make it go away. You thought you'd get away with murder, I said flatly. He didn't argue. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the pain and loss his actions had caused. What? I asked, the question I'd been carrying for months. Why did you have so much power? How did you get away with it for so long? Carson laughed bitterly. Money. Connections. People who needed me to look the other way. I started small, taking bribes, ignoring certain crimes. Then it got bigger. Drug dealers, politicians, businessmen. They all needed a cop they could control. And when my wife complained about you, you saw us as a threat. Yeah, he admitted. You and Brooke were asking questions, filing complaints. I couldn't risk it unraveling. So I made the worst decision of my life. I sat back, processing everything. Part of me wanted to rage, to hurt him the way he'd hurt me. But sitting there, looking at the broken man across from me, I realized something. He was already destroyed. Prison would be his hell, and mine was learning to live without my family. I came here because I needed to see you one last time, I said slowly. To remind myself why I fought so hard. You're not some untouchable monster. You're just a coward who made terrible choices. Carson's eyes filled with tears. I deserve worse than this. You do, I agreed. But this is what you get. Life behind bars. Knowing you destroyed innocent people for your own greed. I stood to leave, but Carson spoke again. Your family, they didn't suffer. The smoke got them before the flames. I know that doesn't help, but I needed you to know. I stopped, hand on the door. Those words did something I didn't expect. They offered a small, painful comfort. Knowing they didn't burn, that the end came quickly, eased a fear I'd carried since that horrible night. Goodbye, Carson, I said without turning around. Goodbye, Colin. I walked out of that prison lighter than I'd entered. Not because I forgave him, I never would, but because I'd finally confronted the man who destroyed my world, looked him in the eye, and realized he no longer had power over me. The final confrontation wasn't dramatic or violent. It was quiet, honest, and raw. It was two men facing the consequences of choices. One who'd lost everything through evil, and one who'd survived through strength. As I drove home, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. I thought of Brooke, Fiona, and Grant. Their laughter, their dreams, their love. They were gone, but their memory would live on through the justice I'd fought for. Carson would rot in prison, and I would rebuild my life, carrying their legacy forward. That was the real victory. 6 months had passed since Carson's sentencing, but time moved differently now. Some days felt like years, others like mere moments. I'd learned that grief doesn't follow a schedule. It comes and goes like waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes crashing hard enough to knock you down. I started volunteering at the Veterans Center downtown, helping other soldiers transition back to civilian life. Sharing stories with men and women who understood loss, who'd seen darkness and survived. It reminded me I wasn't alone. We didn't talk much about the pain. We just sat together, and that was enough. Preston remained a steady friend, checking in weekly, never pushing, just present. Tristan took me fishing one Sunday morning, the silence between us comfortable, healing. Daphne called occasionally, updating me on the additional arrests stemming from Carson's case. 7 officers had been charged, 2 city officials resigned, the corruption slowly being cut out like a cancer. The town changed. People started asking questions, demanding transparency, refusing to accept the old ways of doing things. My family's tragedy became a turning point, proof that speaking up mattered, that justice, though slow, was possible. I visited their graves every week, bringing fresh flowers, talking to them about everything and nothing. I told Brooke about the case, how her courage to file that complaint had ultimately exposed an entire network of crime. I told Fiona about the scholarship fund I'd started in her name for kids who wanted to be teachers. I told Grant about the youth baseball league that now played on a field dedicated to his memory. Their legacy wasn't just in how they died. It was in how their story inspired change. One afternoon, I stood at the memorial site where our house once stood. The burned shell had been demolished, replaced by a small park with benches and a plaque honoring Brooke, Fiona, and Grant. Neighbors had planted trees, created a space for reflection and healing. As I sat on one of the benches, a young woman approached hesitantly. "Are you Colin?" she asked softly. I nodded. "I just wanted to say thank you. My uncle was one of the people Carson threatened into silence. After your case, he finally spoke up. He's getting help now." Her words settled something inside me. The fight hadn't just been about my family. It had been about everyone Carson had hurt, everyone he'd silenced. "I'm glad he found his voice," I said, meaning it. She smiled, tears in her eyes, then walked away. That evening, I sat in my apartment, not the temporary one I'd rented in desperation, but a new place I'd bought, filled with photos, memories, and hope. I was building a life again, different from before, but still mine. The nightmares came less frequently now. When they did, I'd wake up, look at Brooke's picture, and remind myself they were at peace. And I was honoring them by living, not just surviving. I thought about Carson, rotting in his cell, and felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just acceptance. He'd made his choices, and now he lived with the consequences. My energy was better spent on the people and causes that mattered. The Green Beret training that had once prepared me for war had taught me something deeper. Resilience isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every single time, no matter how hard the hit. I'd been knocked down by the worst tragedy imaginable. But I got back up. Justice had been served. My family's story was told. And now, finally, I could begin to heal. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Tomorrow would come, and the day after that, and slowly, painfully, beautifully, life would continue. Brooke, Fiona, and Grant would always be with me, not in the fire and tragedy, but in the love we shared, the memories we made, and the legacy of courage and truth their story left behind. That was enough. That was everything. Story finished before you go. I have to ask you something that's been on my mind. If you lost everything in a single moment, would you have the strength to fight back, or would you let the darkness win? Think about it. I'd love to know where you're watching this from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And please, tell me what kind of stories you want to hear next. Do you like revenge stories? Family betrayal? Emotional justice? Let me know, and I'll bring you exactly the stories you love. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more thrilling and epic revenge stories, and stay tuned. We've got another incredible tale coming your way soon. Until then, take care of yourself, and remember, justice may be slow, but it's always worth fighting for.